It is a delight and an honor to see you all here, and I would echo John's comments on how wonderful it is to spend time with people who have a number of other things to pursue and have elected to take a few moments of their time to pursue what we're about to embark on, which I would like to describe as a bit of a journey. And it's a journey that intends to both take us back and hopefully forward to understand a bit of the dynamics that drive the logic behind what I would like to share with you today. Before I do that, I will dispense with the obligatory, which is, who are you listening to? I love to be in meetings with various federal agencies and international entities around the world where people get up and say, I'm speaking for myself and not for my organization. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm actually speaking for myself and my organization and for a number of other organizations and interests around the world. So I do not disclaim anything that I'm about to say. I actually take not only full responsibility, but expect everything I'm associated with to bear responsibility for what I say too. So there it is, the anti-disclaimer disclaimer. I'm the CEO of MCAM, which is the world's probably most interesting financial institution. We deal with intangible asset risk exposure on a number of levels, including everything from the risks associated with sovereign credits for major infrastructure projects all the way down to rural inventors in northern Gujarat. For those of you who don't know where that is, I'm not going to help you find it, who actually are trying to figure out how to participate in an economy that seems to be jumping past the agrarian economy and into a knowledge economy without going through any of the other perturbations. And it's always an interesting thing to be involved in what is non-evolutionary but is in fact transcending evolution, to actually jump forward in time. And so we do a lot of work in trying to understand the ways in which thought is developed and valued and contested and managed or mismanaged. And our job ultimately is to build a means by which there can be transparent stewardship of what we see as an emerging economy. Now, I like to start with two parables, both of which happen to be both parable and in some shred true somewhere. The first parable actually starts June of 1815, which I mark as the date of the birth of the knowledge economy. Now, the funny thing is, most people go, June 1815, don't you mean 1980 or something? We get uncomfortable with this notion that the knowledge economy was born before we actually had a mature industrial economy. June 1815. I'm going to ask a question, and I like, because I used to be a professor at the University of Virginia, I like to actually have people participate at this point in the conversation. Does anybody know what happened on June 18th, 1815? That's a great guess. What happened at Waterloo? I'm sorry?
Napoleon was defeated.
Napoleon was defeated. By whom? By Wellington. I love to have people who actually know what they're talking about in the room. I love the story of June 18th to June 20th, 1815. Because there was no battle at Waterloo. If you actually look at the battlefield, you know that it wasn't Waterloo at all. In fact, it was quite a bit of a distance from Waterloo. As a matter of fact, if you actually look at the reason why it's called the Battle of Waterloo, you realize that the reason it was called the Battle of Waterloo is because the Crown observers were staying in Waterloo. That was the address of their Days Inn or their Holiday Inn or their Grand Hyatt or their W or wherever the heck they were staying for the battle. That's where they were. But it's not where the battle was. Another interesting fact is if you actually look at how Wellington and Napoleon had engaged on that battlefield, you realize that if you were standing in Waterloo and watching the engagement, Wellington lost. And lo and behold, the Crown observers who observed the Battle of Waterloo knew that Wellington had lost. And so they promptly packed up their things. It's a good time to get out of town before, people figure out you're there. And they got out of town and they went back to London, and sometime early on the 19th, they reported that Wellington had been defeated by Napoleon at Waterloo. You heard this correctly. Wellington had been defeated at Waterloo, none of which were true. All of which were true. None of which were true. I'm going to let that hang in the sky like a brick doesn't just for a second, because you're going to get to the so what of this in just a minute. Because there was another observer on the field. The other observer on the field was a young man who was under the employ of a gentleman by the name of Baron Nathan von Rothschild. He, unlike the Crown observers, was actually on the battlefield. And it turns out that he saw a very different outcome. Oddly enough, because he was there. That helps. It helps to actually be there to report on what happened. That part helps a little bit. But what was great about it was, as a matter of fact, as Wellington had, as some accounts have it, actually struck colors, there was, in fact, a flanking maneuver by the Prussians, who, with Wellington distracted and Napoleon distracted, came in and actually decimated Napoleon's army, leading to Napoleon's defeat, not at Waterloo. This gentleman, Rothwell was his name, hired passage across the Channel, and at 10 o'clock, give or take 2 minutes, on the morning of the 19th, knocked on the gates at the palace to report that, in fact, Wellington had won. Now, the Crown officially had it from their reliable sources that Wellington had been defeated. And they sent Rothwell away, saying, "I'm sorry, you don't have the facts, young man. Go away." What happened next is actually recorded in a series of archives, and I have to give tribute where tribute is due to Lord Salisbury, Robert Cecil, who lives north of London up in a wonderful old King James ex-residence. And it turns out that what happened was Rothwell went to Rothschild and said, "Wellington has won, and we believe we lost." And Rothschild had an idea. He decided to go to the market that day, and most of the accounts established the time at about 10:18, walked into the London Exchange with, and I quote, his usual lack of frivolity and pallor, and instructed all of his agents to sell all of his shares. Now, this was Baron Nathan von Rothschild, the guy that had the best facts on the ground, best information, and if he was selling everything, not to be too colloquial, but you know what that meant. He must know that the Crown had just been handed a massive defeat by Napoleon. At which point in time, everybody decided to sell, which they did. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the estimate is that 86% of the tradable securities of the entire United Kingdom, 86% of the tradable securities of the United Kingdom were liquid in the market in 4 hours. At which point in time, Rothschild put in buy orders. Now, it was actually several weeks later when Rothschild was allegedly quoted as saying, "I care not what puppet monarch sits on the crown of the empire upon whom the sun never sets. For he who controls the money of the empire controls the empire, and I control the money. Why would somebody say that? Why would a person make an allegation which sounds dangerously close to treason, and not only get away with it, but be able to keep title to the Bank of England for the next 42 years? Well, because it was true. Because he controlled 86% of the floatable treasury and securities of the United Kingdom in one trading day. Was that the knowledge economy at work? I'd say it's a pretty compelling knowledge economy kind of story. Well, that's a very wonderful question, and I have had the privilege of sitting down with the Rothschild family several occasions, and I suspect it's a larger number than we all care to imagine right now, but it is a still large number. They certainly still have what we would consider to be a relatively significant interest in the most polite terms possible. Now, the interesting anecdote to that story is that some people don't know Rothschild also was a fiduciary manager of the Bank of France at the same time. A lot of people forget that. He was actually fiduciary responsible for the Bank of England and for the Bank of France. And you heard me correctly. They were at war, remember? They were fighting each other. And this guy somehow sat between. Is that the knowledge economy at work? Now, here's where I leave the reservation. This was the normal. That was a nice little case history of history and all that kind of stuff. And you can go back and read all the documents, and it's all cool. Here's where I leave the reservation. There's a story of an oracle that was outside the city of Troy. And I told you that this is going to be a mix of kind of the fantasy of mythology and the substance of fact. That's what I like to integrate. There was an oracle that actually stood outside of the city of Troy and said, "What fools are ye to bring this horse into the city? For I know that inside this horse there are men." And people go, "Well, you know, this is a crackpot futurist over here. They're a member of an Arlington Institute. And really, to appease the gods, we really ought to haul this horse into the city." That's it. Just the same brick sitting in the air like bricks don't. Okay? Why do I start with these two stories? I start with these two stories to reassure all of us that neither of these could ever happen again. Because we now are in the knowledge economy. We actually have divined the difference between the Greek term eidos and the Greek term gnosis. In antiquities, people thought they understood facts, but we now live in a world where we do. And so the reason I start with these stories is to remind ourselves of how far advanced we are and how sure we can be that none of this could ever happen again. You couldn't have a situation where in a single day, 86% of the stock market could blow away. That can't happen because we're in the knowledge economy. We couldn't have a day when a horse would be drug into the city because, after all, we now listen to multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multi-perspective voices. We respect them. We appreciate them. We've found ways to integrate those voices into our thought process. So I'm going to take you forward 2 years to show you how it can never happen again. There is an event that is certain.